The rain had just stopped, but the sky was still gray, heavy, and broken like the hearts that stood under it. The little wooden church at the edge of town had just finished a service that no child should ever have to witness. A small blonde girl in a plain white dress sat quietly at the corner of the cemetery, clutching a wilted flower in her tiny hands. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her hair tangled and messy, her blue eyes swollen from crying. She had just said goodbye to her mother, the only person in the world who had ever made her feel safe, loved, and protected. And now, at only 6 years old, she was already learning what loneliness truly meant. But what happened next would make her nightmare even worse. As the guests drifted away, whispering condolences and walking back to their cars, the little girl's stepfather stood over her. He had been distant during the funeral, hardly shedding a tear, his jaw tight and his eyes cold. When he looked at her, there was no trace of love or compassion. Instead, there was only bitterness. He grabbed her small suitcase, stuffed hurriedly with clothes, and tossed it into the dirt beside her. His voice, sharp and cruel, broke through the silence of the cemetery. "You're not my responsibility. I never wanted you. Your mother is gone, and so are you. Don't come back." With that, he turned his back and walked away, leaving her sitting on the damp ground, shaking from fear and heartbreak. It was the kind of scene that seared itself into the heart of anyone who witnessed it, a helpless little girl abandoned at her lowest moment. The world suddenly seemed darker, colder, and crueler. And yet, what she didn't know was that this painful ending was also the beginning of something extraordinary. Because just as her stepfather disappeared into the distance, fate was preparing to send someone into her life who would change everything forever. Glowing star, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of love to heal broken hearts, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Kindness Glow, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Your support helps us spread more stories that inspire the world. Glowing star. The little girl, whose name was Emily, dragged the suitcase closer to her and hugged it tightly, as if it was her only connection to her mother. Inside, buried beneath the clothes, was a small framed picture of the two of them smiling together. Emily pressed it against her chest and whispered softly through her tears, "I miss you, Mommy. Please don't leave me all alone." Hours passed, and the cemetery grew silent. The sky darkened into twilight. Emily sat near the gravestone until the groundskeeper gently told her she couldn't stay there overnight. She had nowhere to go. With tiny footsteps, she carried her suitcase down the dirt road, hoping someone, anyone, would notice her pain. But in small towns, people often see more than they are willing to act upon. A few cars slowed down when they spotted the little girl walking by herself, but no one stopped. Some looked away, thinking perhaps she belonged to someone nearby. Others didn't want to get involved. And so Emily kept walking, her shoes caked with mud, her dress stained, her little body shivering against the night air. Eventually, she sat down under a tree by the roadside. She had not eaten since the morning, and her stomach ached with hunger. More than that, her heart ached with longing, for her mother's gentle voice, her warm embrace, her lullabies at night. But all she had was the cold wind and the memory of the cruel words her stepfather had shouted. It was then, under that tree, that her fate quietly shifted. A car with shining headlights appeared in the distance. It wasn't an ordinary car, it was a sleek black vehicle that seemed out of place in this quiet countryside road. As it approached, it slowed down, and finally, it stopped right in front of her. The door opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped out. He carried a leather briefcase, and his shoes were polished, but what stood out most was not his wealth, it was the kindness in his eyes as he looked at her. Why is a little girl sitting alone on a dark road, he thought to himself. Something about her tugged at his heart immediately. He could have driven on, telling himself it wasn't his problem. But he didn't. Something deeper, almost instinctive, made him kneel beside her and ask softly, "Are you all right, little one?" Emily looked up, her eyes wide and filled with tears. She clutched her suitcase tighter and shook her head. She didn't have the strength to speak. The man noticed the photograph frame peeking from inside the suitcase. He gently pulled it out and saw the smiling face of a woman holding Emily in her arms. He understood at once. This girl had lost her mother. And she had no one else. What he didn't reveal in that moment was that he, too, had once lost everything. He, too, knew what it meant to feel utterly alone in the world. And perhaps that was why destiny had led him down that very road on that very night. As he lifted Emily gently into his arms, he made a silent vow: her story would not end in sorrow. Not if he had anything to do with it. The man's name was Alexander Hayes, though most people in the city knew him simply as Mr. Hayes, the quiet millionaire with a tragic past. On the surface, he seemed to have everything: wealth, power, and a reputation as one of the most successful businessmen in the state. But what few knew was that behind his success was a heart carrying scars that never fully healed. Years earlier, he had lost his wife and daughter in a car accident. Their absence had hollowed him, leaving him wandering through life with achievements that felt meaningless, dinners eaten alone in silence, and nights spent staring at photographs that reminded him of what he no longer had. So when Alexander saw Emily, her small trembling hands, the grief in her innocent eyes, the photograph of her and her mother, something inside him cracked open. It was as if fate had placed her in his path, not just for her sake, but for his. Without hesitation, he lifted her gently from the roadside, carried her to his car, and placed her in the back seat. She curled up like a fragile bird, still clutching her suitcase, and though her tears had dried, her face held the exhaustion of someone far older than 6 years should carry. The ride to his mansion was quiet. Alexander didn't ask questions right away. He knew that sometimes silence was the gentlest form of kindness. He let the soft hum of the engine comfort her. The night outside grew darker, the countryside fading into the glow of the city skyline. Emily stared out the window, her small reflection flickering against the glass. Every now and then, she glanced at Alexander through the rearview mirror, uncertain of who he was or what he intended. But something about his steady presence, calm, patient, unhurried, made her feel, for the first time since her mother's passing, that maybe she wasn't completely alone. When they arrived at his estate, Emily's eyes widened. It was nothing like the modest home she had shared with her mother. The mansion stood tall, surrounded by manicured gardens, fountains, and lights that glowed warmly against the night. Yet, despite its grandeur, Emily hesitated. She clutched the photograph tighter and whispered, almost as if asking permission from her mother's spirit, "Is it okay if I go in?" Alexander, noticing her hesitation, knelt down and spoke softly, though not in a way that demanded trust but offered it. "This is just a place to rest. You're safe here. No one will hurt you." His voice carried a weight that made Emily believe him, even if she didn't understand why. Inside, the warmth of the home wrapped around her like a blanket. For the first time since the funeral, she sat at a table where a meal awaited her. It was simple: soup, bread, and warm milk, but to Emily, it felt like a feast. She ate slowly, politely, though hunger gnawed at her. Alexander watched from across the table, his heart heavy as memories of his own daughter flashed before him. The way Emily's small hands gripped the spoon reminded him so much of her. That night, he led her to a guest bedroom. The walls were painted soft cream, the bed layered with clean white sheets. Emily placed her suitcase on the floor and carefully set the framed photograph on the nightstand, as if anchoring herself to the only piece of family she had left. She looked up at Alexander and asked quietly, "Will I be sent away tomorrow?" Her voice cracked, filled with the fear of abandonment she had already tasted too soon. Alexander paused, his chest tightening. He didn't yet know what the future would hold, whether he could take legal guardianship, whether Emily's stepfather might try to interfere, or whether he himself was ready to reopen his wounded heart. But he did know one thing with certainty: he could not, and would not, let her return to a life of neglect and cruelty. So he answered gently, "Not tonight. Tonight, you're safe." Emily nodded, then lay down on the bed, curling around the photograph. Within minutes, she was asleep. But Alexander stood in the doorway long after, watching over her like a silent guardian. Something about her presence softened the cold emptiness that had haunted his home for years. For the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe his wealth and power could finally serve a purpose beyond himself. The following days brought challenges. Emily woke from nightmares, crying out for her mother. She wandered the halls of the mansion, clutching her photograph, afraid of being left alone. At mealtimes, she sometimes refused to eat, her grief overwhelming her appetite. Yet, slowly, she began to open up. One morning, she sat beside Alexander in the garden, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. She whispered, "My mommy used to love flowers. She said they always bloom again, even after the cold." Alexander listened, his throat tightening. He thought of his late wife, who had once said something similar. It felt as if life had placed this child before him to remind him that broken hearts could, in fact, bloom again. As days turned into weeks, Emily's laughter, soft at first, then brighter, began to echo through the mansion. She discovered a room filled with books and spent afternoons flipping through fairy tales. She played with the stray dog Alexander had rescued years ago but had never paid much attention to. Together, they filled the house with life that had long been missing. But shadows still lingered. Alexander knew Emily's stepfather could return, demanding custody, not out of love, but for other reasons. The man had a reputation for gambling debts and greed, and Alexander feared he might see Emily as a burden or, worse, as leverage for money. That possibility haunted him. He hired the best lawyers quietly, preparing in case the day of confrontation came. For now, though, he focused on the present, on giving Emily back a childhood stolen too soon. And in doing so, he found his own life healing in ways he never expected. For a few weeks, life began to resemble something close to peace for Emily. She was still grieving, still carrying the weight of her mother's absence, but with Alexander's protection, her world felt less frightening. She attended school again, dressed in clean clothes, carried her little suitcase no more, and began to smile at simple joys like drawing, reading, and playing in the garden. For Alexander, each day she laughed was a victory, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, spring eventually found a way back. But peace never lasts without being tested. One gray afternoon, just as Emily was painting in the study, the heavy gates of Alexander's estate swung open. A familiar, dreaded figure walked up the driveway, her stepfather. His expression was cold, his eyes sharp, and his presence carried the same menace Emily had once known all too well. She froze, the paintbrush slipping from her hand as fear gripped her small frame. Alexander met him at the door, his towering figure calm but unyielding. The stepfather's tone was harsh, demanding. He claimed Emily was his responsibility, that she belonged to him, that Alexander had no right to keep her. But his words carried no love, no genuine concern, only entitlement and greed. He spoke of money, of debts, of how he could be compensated if Alexander wanted to play father. Emily, hearing his voice, ran into Alexander's arms, clutching his shirt, burying her face against him as though trying to disappear. Alexander wrapped his arms around her protectively, his eyes burning with a fire he hadn't felt in years. He had lost one daughter before, and he would not, under any circumstance, lose another, not this innocent child who had already endured too much. That night, Alexander's team of lawyers filed for custody. The courtroom battle was tense, filled with accusations and counterarguments. The stepfather tried to paint himself as a grieving widower, unfairly judged, while Alexander stood firm, his quiet strength speaking louder than any theatrics. But what ultimately swayed the court was Emily herself. When the judge gently asked her where she wanted to live, Emily, with trembling lips and teary eyes, pointed at Alexander and whispered, "With him. He makes me feel safe." The courtroom fell silent. Even the stepfather, for all his bluster, could not fight the simple, undeniable truth of a child's heart. The judge ruled in Alexander's favor, granting him full guardianship. That day, Emily was no longer just a girl abandoned after her mother's funeral, she became the beloved daughter of a man who had once thought he would never have family again. The transformation that followed was nothing short of beautiful. Emily bloomed in ways no one could have imagined. She excelled in school, discovered a love for painting, and often filled Alexander's study with her colorful artwork. On weekends, they visited the countryside, where she picked flowers and laughed in the sunshine, reminding him of all the beauty he had once lost. And slowly, the mansion that had been silent for years turned into a home filled with love, warmth, and second chances. Alexander, too, changed. The emptiness in his eyes gave way to purpose. The grief that had once chained him to the past loosened with every smile Emily shared. He realized that while he could never replace the family he had lost, he could honor them by loving and protecting the child who had been placed in his path. In giving Emily a future, he had given himself one too. Years later, on a bright spring morning, Emily, now a confident young woman, stood in the same garden where she had once whispered about her mother's love for flowers. She turned to Alexander and said softly, "Mommy was right. Flowers bloom again after the cold." And so did we. Tears filled Alexander's eyes, but they were not of sorrow, they were of gratitude. Because life, despite its cruelty, had led them to each other. Two broken souls who found healing not in wealth or power, but in kindness, love, and the courage to care when it mattered most. Glowing star, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Glow. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire hope and remind us all of the power of compassion. Glowing Star. Speech Balloon Special Request: before you go, comment below with the words, "Kindness heals," if you believe that love and compassion can change lives. And remember, sometimes the greatest miracles are not found in grand gestures, but in the simple act of opening your heart when someone needs it most.